stabilize the community, because by this time, the Crown, provincial government, and city had bulldozed many, many lots, and basically the area looked like many inner city neighborhoods in the American cities of LA, Chicago, Boston, etc., New York, where there would be one building and then vacant lots, and basically it just contributes to an image of a decaying inner city where nobody wants to live. So they decided that they wanted to build houses in these inner city lots and affordable housing, and basically to restore and stabilize the family residential character of the neighborhood. Go to the next one. So these are some of my key research questions. I won't read that slide so you can read it yourself. These are some of the questions that I'm looking at. Go to the next slide. Methods of inquiry. This research to do a case study is very useful, because in a case study approach, you can use multi-methods. And basically, we're using participatory action research methods. And myself and another person, Nora McGarry, who was actually hired on the project as a research assistant, we're using collaborative autoethnography, auto-inquiry. So we're interviewing each other, and between the two of us, we're restoring our memory of what was going on at the time and the actors involved. We're using mnemonic techniques in our focus groups and with ourselves, photograph albums, and creating timelines. We're using oral narratives, we're using archival research, interviews, focus groups. And something that we're using here is digital storytelling techniques, like photo, voice, and journaling, and perhaps video documentaries that the participants themselves will participate in producing, and that then will become part of the product of the project for dissemination. Okay, here's a Strathcona Area Housing Society, that's what SAS stands for. Board meeting, this should be 1970. And this is my mother, and guess who that is? Okay, move on. Okay, early findings. I'm a little out of time. No. So basically, Spoda's interest in building co-op housing was primarily about securing and stabilizing the neighborhood. So it wasn't primarily about providing shelter in the sense of housing, but it was a political strategy to stabilize the neighborhood. And this motivation informed all their decisions. There were several phases of action, and I divided it into 4 phases. So the first phase was what I would call a protest phase. And basically, they lobbied to stop slum clearance, stop urban renewal, stop expropriation. So it's basically a real resistant move. And then in the second phase, which lasted from 1970 to 1975, they turned into a property development organization through its Strathcona Area Housing Society. And so not only did they build houses, but they also got involved in physical and social planning for the neighborhood. So health clinics, social welfare, education, community centers, these were all things that they started to plan. They continued to fight the engineering department's plans to put the freeway through, and they created a linear park which stopped the through traffic through the neighborhood into the downtown core. And there were many, many other innovations that they created. They worked collaboratively with the University of British Columbia, the School of Architecture and Planning and Social Work, so there was always this flow between the academy and the community. And it really is a model of the kinds of processes that we will be talking about this morning. Spoda always leveraged political capital from their limited cultural capital. Now you have to remember that this is a low literate neighborhood. Many of the people did not speak English, and they did not have higher education. But they did have a huge amount of cultural capital. And they used things like Chinese banquets as lobbying techniques, open houses, ribbon cutting ceremonies, tea ceremonies, walking tours of the neighborhood to show backyard gardens and lovely gardens that people would keep. And this area had been red circled since the 1950s. And by red circling, I don't know if you know what that is, but any area that is red circled by the city, no insurance company would provide insurance for those homes. And so from the outside, people stopped repairing and fixing up their homes because they weren't getting insurance from it. But on the inside and in the backyards, they were very well taken care of homes. And in fact, prior to the demolition of these homes and expropriation of these homes, the Strathcona neighborhood, despite it being an extremely low-income neighborhood, had the highest rate, or the second highest rate of freehold land title, like no mortgages, freehold, that people own their homes. The first highest was Shaughnessy, which is a real upper-middle class neighborhood that restricted non-whites for residents. So Strathcona and Shaughnessy, but that mattered nothing in this vision of the modern city that Vancouver had at the time. Okay, so go on. So here's an example. Now, in this picture, it's very interesting. This is the mayor, Art Phillips. This is Margaret Mitchell, the MP, federal MP. This is the Art Lee, another federal MP, and then SPOTA members here. And you'll see this man up there, Joe Way. He's an architect who helped with designing the houses and designing the neighborhood. So just to show you, they really knew how to mobilize political capital and academic capital. You can just go ahead. Okay, I'm going to move that. Just a picture of the co-op housing. Now, we talk about sustainable development. The residents, or the prospective residents in this infill housing, which consolidated 5 lots, I think, 5 lots, and they built 7 units on 5 lots. These are narrow 25-foot lots as well. And they built it in a courtyard style because they wanted to share in food production. So I just wanted to show you that that was already happening in the 1970s. Here's one of these ribbon cutting ceremonies that I talked about. Just keep going. And we tried to do, this is an example of some of the mapping timelines that we tried to do. Just want to hit that again. How much money was involved in, this was a rehabilitation that Jessica and I talked about. It was really Jessica's language. The idea, what we're doing is we're developing studies into subaltern cooperatives. And in order to make that visible, we have to use anti-racist decolonizing frameworks, because you can't do this work of understanding cooperatives as a tool of resistance to hegemonic nation formation unless you bring in these frameworks. Okay, so these are some of the critical questions I'm asking, and also that we do have to look seriously at people's agency here, and to get there we have to go through critical theories of subject identity formation, and this is where feminist theories help us a lot. Okay, and okay. See that the future, what does it mean for the future? Well, it means that the diversity of Canadian society and the rapid transformations in our population means that we actually have to take seriously the notion that cooperatives are in fact located in multiracial, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-class kind of dynamics and relations, and that those same dynamics are going to play themselves out inside the organization. So when we think about theorizing management of co-ops, got to bring that stuff in and think about it outside of, hey, that's it. Thank you.
You can do your own slides, Brandon.
On the specific case of Japanese fishing cooperatives, associations, and the language is actually interesting. Although Japanese fishing cooperatives from the time of the first Japanese immigration to Canada in the 1880s up until internment in 1942, when the Japanese were removed from the coast and moved inland at the time of the Second World War. Now, they may not be considered to be cooperatives in the traditional sense, and our research has really focused on this idea that if you simply look at cooperatives within the traditional Rochdale model, you're maybe missing a lot of cooperative activity that is happening in our society, and failing to understand that these cooperatives in many cases were formed as a result of racial exclusion is to miss a central fact, in fact, of how they operated, why they were formed, and what they accomplished. So in the context that I'm working in here is the salmon rush that essentially existed on the Fraser River and all along the British BC coastline, starting in about the 1880s. And so the white fishermen and the Japanese fishermen joined the native fishermen who had been fishing since time immemorial on the very rich salmon resources that existed in the rivers of British Columbia. So there was salmon canneries were popping up along the Fraser River. Numerous canneries. They were served by white, native, and Japanese as the Japanese started to arrive. And the cannery workers themselves were primarily in the initial years were native, Aboriginal women, and Chinese workers inside the canneries. The industry itself was highly racialized. There were clear racial groups between the whites, the natives, and the Japanese fishermen, and then the Chinese workers in the canneries. So they operated as distinct racial groups, and starting in 1889, the white fishermen organized a fishing association, and shortly after that was formed, the Japanese fishermen who were arriving in very large numbers applied to join, and they were refused. It was straight up racist exclusion, and they were not allowed to join the cooperative. At the time, there was an informal organization of Japanese fishermen, and that was formalized as an organization in 1897. It went through a number of different names. In the year 1900, it became the Fraser River Japanese Fishermen's Benevolent Association, but everybody referred to it as the Dantai, which in Japanese means group. And this is kind of highlights its mostly informal nature, although it did have a formalized, institutionalized structure as an association. It was known as the group. And for our purposes, it's very interesting to look at how it operated, how it was organized, and how it interreacted with the other racial groups that were operating on the Fraser River. Now, this is the Dantai on the Fraser River. There were also it's a complex and interesting story. There were also associations forming on the Skeena River in northern British Columbia, and there were groups that were forming on Vancouver Island, on the west side of Vancouver Island in Tofino and Ucluelet. So the question arises, I mean, are these actually true cooperatives? They're referred to as associations, sometimes fishermen's unions, and in terms of the traditional Rochdale model, they may not be. But they were certainly an autonomous association of persons who voluntarily cooperate for their mutual social, economic, and cultural benefit. And we believe from the research that we've been doing that they have to be seen in the context of their time, the racism that existed and what they were facing as a group. So there was, in certain respects, like they were not cooperatives. There was not open membership, but of course that was because they were kept out of the white fishermen's associations. They were not allowed to join the white fishermen's associations, and so it's sort of a moot point in a sense that, you know, if they were open and had open membership, that it could be argued that they were anti-discrimination, because they were formed essentially to fight against the racial exclusion that they were suffering. They were in many respects, they operated like a union, because these were the organizations that were used to, when there was collective bargaining with canneries over the price of fish, but they also operated like mutual aid societies. So in at the very beginning of the Dantai, the purpose that caused their formation as an association was the need for a hospital, a shot of the Japanese hospital in the early part of the century, and the Japanese school. And the language used to describe this group of people is also indicative of the racial exclusion that existed. If you read the newspaper accounts of the time, if you read all of the literature of the time, they're only ever referred to as the Japanese. It's never Japanese Canadians. It's never anything but the Japanese, even though by this time many of them are in fact naturalized immigrants. They're Canadian citizens, but they're referred to as the Japanese. The Fraser River Strike of 1900 was a critical turning point in the organization of the associations, especially on the Fraser River, because suddenly it was realized that in fact they were a powerful force on the river. In 1900 there was a strike in which the canneries were offering one price for the salmon that they purchased from the fishermen, and the fishermen themselves wanted more. And the fishermen were divided along racial lines as to what kind of price they would accept for the salmon that they were selling to the canneries. But in the strike of 1900, it was suddenly realized that in fact the Japanese Canadians, the Nikkei as they call themselves, the Nikkei fishers, were the dominant force on the Fraser River. They outnumbered the white fishermen by a considerable margin. At one point there was a march in protest against the price offered by the canneries. On one day, the white fishermen mustered about 500 fishermen, and the next day, the Japanese Canadians, the Nikkei fishers, responded with about 4,000 fishermen in a march against the canneries. So, throughout the history of the Dantai and the other fishing associations on the coast, they were also uplifted behind in my slides here. In conclusion, I would say that racial exclusion was a central fact of the Japanese Canadian fishing cooperatives of the West Coast, and that the study of it is absolutely required if we are to gain a more complete understanding of how they operate. We're really in kind of the early stages.
Is that a good question?
Okay, we now have a little bit of time for questions. I actually wanted to take the prerogative of the chair and combine a few things, especially since my name was mentioned. One of the things it was exciting to find out was the connections between my research and the research they're doing. And I've been doing research on African American cooperatives and finding actually much of the same thing, operating out of necessity from racial exclusion, racial discrimination. Also the notion that co-ops aren't really just a European phenomenon, and it didn't really all start with the Rochdale, even though that's where we all seem to in the co-op world have our frame. So trying to think through what are the other manifestations of this kind of cooperative economics and what are the traditions and how they've been used. So that's where I had started fooling around with the word. Actually, I had started thinking about subaltern cooperative economic development as a term to explain, subaltern means cultures that are marginalized in the hegemonic system where they're not the dominant system. So I was thinking if we talk about subaltern cultures using their own agency to create identities within that hegemonic system, there's probably subaltern economics in the same sense of using that sense of isolation and separation and being dominated as a way to create some kind of economic agency, create your own economic space because you're so excluded. And so I started thinking of what groups would fit under that. So it was great to find them doing that work. I know I've been trying to connect with Aboriginal work in Canada. I've also been trying to work with some other groups. We actually now come up with an idea for a book, so We're going to be pursuing that. To both do a little bit of the theory and then also a lot of these different case studies from Canada, the U.S., and probably other areas, maybe Central and South America, that kind of thing. So I just wanted to mention that. Oh, the other thing I just wanted to say too is in my work with African American co-ops, it's the same stuff. They started mutual aid societies. And for my book, I've been saying that mutual aid societies were precursors. They're direct precursors of the mutual insurance companies, and they were precursors of the what became the Rochdale co-op systems. And so when you study those, it's the same thing. They're also piecing together every place where they're excluded. So the health care, death and dying benefits to members, care for widows, and then they start moving into stores, schools, credit unions, hospitals, that kind of thing. So it's really interesting to now see that you guys have been finding the same kind of trajectory. So I just thought I'd put that in. And now, comments, questions? Oh gosh, we've got lots. So we'll start over here with Kat.
Just quick, I actually don't know exactly what a mutual aid society is.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, I
yeah.
understand the words.
Well, I don't know if you want to say it or I can explain it. Ryan?
To help themselves. They don't have United Way. Think about that. There's no Ministry of Human Resources that's going to. So, you get sick. Somebody has to take care of you. Somebody dies, needs to be cared for. They can take care of that. So, sharing resources and food. So, if somebody's in need, there's a group that will take care of that.
Often a fraternity or a church or a social society, what you do is the members of the mutual aid society all put in dues, right? So if it's for the sick, then you put in your $1 a year or 10 cents a month or whatever, and then if you get sick, you don't have to put in any more money. Sometimes there's a copay, so it's similar to insurance policy, but it's semi-informally, but these are actual organizations that operate under very strict rules, like how much money you put in each month, what services you get in exchange. So if you do get sick, you get hospitalization, or you get, the agency then takes the money that you already put in and helps to pay your hospital bill. If you're actually going to a hospital, they might actually pay for a nurse, and then anybody in the agency who gets sick goes to that nurse for free or for a smaller copay. They do it for death, for burial, right? You put in every year, and then when somebody dies in your family, you don't have to pay for the burial. It's already covered by the society pays it.
But that's not considered cooperative.
Well, these are all if you're talking about Rochdale co-ops, which is what our movement talks about, right? These are all things that happened from the 1700s in the U.S. I imagine maybe even earlier in other places.
And mutual aid I know in the Chinese Canadian case looks different than that.
Oh, okay, so it's not.
We have Chinese benevolent associations, and they also are different. And I think that in your case, the Japanese Canadian associations probably look a little bit different too.
Yeah, I think without maybe looking at the actual formal structure, you could say a mutual aid society is any group of people getting together to help themselves for some purpose.
Right.
And it may be, like as Jessica was explaining, it may be considered a precursor to the Rochdale cooperative model, or it could be considered another form of cooperation.
Well, and I guess like part of the confusion here is interesting because part of our argument is that all of these concepts have their own history, and if we don't look specifically at that history, we just end up with these general categories that
Right,
don't.
they don't mean anything once you
Yes.
Right, so great question, thank you.
I want to comment that the kibbutzim are
Yes.
not built to get rid of the Palestinians. I don't know who is the Gorlitsky. I know the literature of kibbutz for 50 years now, and I never met him, and I think that it's better to get truly history of kibbutz from historians. I don't know who is that, what is that Gorlitsky. The kibbutzim, they have part in the Zionist project, and the Zionist project changed within the years, and of course after the 67 war, it's get some kind of process of reading with the Palestinians, and very few kibbutzim was involved in settling on Palestinian lands, but this is not a real history of the kibbutz. So I prefer that discovery.
Do not count that.
And you have to check the literature.
Yeah, well, and I'm certainly not an expert on the kibbutz movement, so I'm happy to share the source with you. His argument is that that the kibbutz movement had links to Zionism and that it was used to consolidate the settler project. And Gorlitsky instrument that marks the politics of this project in Broadway, and of course will attract predictable blowback from the guardians of the Rochdale narrative. But one thing about the Rochdale narrative, of course, is that it is a diffusionist narrative. It starts in an imperial center, in the underbelly of that imperial center, and it diffuses to emerge into long-standing underbellies of marginality across the empire and beyond. It strikes me that subaltern is one term, but it might need supplementarity from something more grounded, not in the specific case of India and the rise of subaltern studies in India, but something maybe located within Canada, within our particular histories, indigenous Anglo-French immigrant or European immigrant, and what that means. I wonder if some notion of not diffusion, but what is it that lies on the other side of that diffusionist singular model? Is it interfusion, confusion, which can be good, of course, as we know, but it's not very popular in the academy. How could you articulate the culturalist in a way that counters the diffusionist?
Excellent.
Good question.
Well, you know, the other thing that the subaltern doesn't pick up is what we're finding, Brian and I, both of us, really we had to really think through transnational cultural flows. Even in the idea that, you know, the Rochdale diffused outwards and then it was picked up and transformed, but it had an originary point.
Right.
But we're not, what we want to do is move away from that and actually say, you know, there are many places of diffusion. There are multiple places of diffusion. There are alternative cooperative subaltern economies, if you want to put it that way, but we won't. But the idea that even in boat building, you know, I think tell the story of Matsumoto, aluminum, you know, the most famous aluminum boats on the coast that all the canneries wanted was produced by Matsumoto. He had that technology, the idea for it, from Japan, from the craft and skills of metalwork in Japan. And he brought that to Canada, and then after the exclusion from the coast, he moved to Trail, BC, inland.
Yeah.
And they were trucking his boats.
He was building boats inland
Inland.
and trucking them to the
They
coast.
were so fantastic. There was nothing on the coast that could, you know, compare. So how do you explain that? A new economy, right? You have to think transnationally. Similarly, cooperatives were not strange to Chinese Canadian immigrants. They had lived with village-level cooperatives for thousands of years. You know, it's just different than spinners working in a village in, sorry. But, you know, that was one narrative. So that's one of the reasons I'm saying, let's ask ourselves, why is this dominant narrative of cooperative? What work does it do? And it's not innocent. It is meant to exclude other realities, other histories. It is meant to put in place and keep in place a racial hierarchy and racial knowledge hierarchy. I call it a racial economy of knowledge. In the same way that Said outlined in his magnificent work, Orientalism. You know, this hegemonic Rochdale model actually performs, for me, the same function. It silences our histories of marginalized communities in self-help and self-reliance. So leave that with you.
Yeah, we're running out of time. I'm going to do Isabel and then Bill have the last one. Sorry.
I'm not sure that I have requested as much as a comment to echo that, you know, it is a wonderful project, and to suggest that, you know, multiplying
our histories is an enrichment. It's not taking away from. But the power of the dominant narrative is there not only in co-op studies and those historical moments that are seen as originary and singular and that become the dominant.
The marginalized population to take cooperative as a tool of development is the Inuit cooperative. I have been lucky enough to stay a little bit over there in Nunavik, which is northern Quebec, and they've been able to break the monopoly of the Hudson Bay Company. It was a monopoly really strong, and the co-op movement have been able in all 14 villages to build a cooperative and take that responsibility for different kind of activities. And now it's pretty much, they're everywhere, and I'm dreaming of the day that once finally that Inuit cooperative will come south and teach us how to, because they develop a multi-service cooperative, which is the model that some really small communities are trying to build because they are devitalizing, if that's a word. Well, the small villages, you understand what I'm saying, sorry. But they have a beautiful model that it works, and it's also in an equation with their own culture. But we would have so much to learn from them, but I don't know how and when it will be possible to create this unit. I think that the kind of research and studies you're doing is really working on that in that sense.
Yeah, we're into break time, but I see a couple people still want to talk, so if you're willing to stay.
When you're choosing what you want to be, is there a lot of econometrics? Or was the econometrics like statistical? Or is there more than one?
Probably not. I think I already will accommodate all this stuff.
So you like reading that model? But then he gives you numbers, and he's like, flip them into the model. Yeah, but it doesn't give you the model. So you have to.
Hi, welcome everyone. Okay, I'm Erin Hancock with the Canadian Cooperative Association, also program coordinator for the Measuring the Cooperative Difference Research Network. So we're very pleased to be able to host this panel today, where we have 4 projects within our network that will be presented. And so I want to introduce our first, we're going to rearrange the order a bit to keep things spicy. So, and also because Ian is chatting somewhere, and we can find him, track him down. So we've got Judith Lipp, who's starting today with the presentation here, The Emergence of Renewable Energy Cooperatives in Canada, examining the slow pace of change. And so Judith is the Executive Director for the Toronto Renewable Energy Cooperative, and also interim chair of the Cooperative Network for Community Power in Ontario. So let's have a warm welcome for Judith.
Thanks, Erin. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Yeah, so just very quickly, there's a lot to say about the project, so I'm not going to do that. But I think it's an important initiative that the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada is supporting. It's a 5-year study looking at the cooperative sector and how it distinguishes itself from other forms of enterprise. So myself and J.J. McMurtry are working together on looking at the renewable energy co-op sector, which is a new emerging form of cooperative in Canada. It's fairly well established in other parts of the world, principally in some Northern European countries. And I guess, what's interesting about the Cura and why myself as a practitioner really, is pleased to be a part of it is it's an opportunity for us as practitioners to do research, and that's not often easy to do. We tend to get pretty bogged down in the day-to-day practical elements of developing co-ops. So this is a unique opportunity. We use students a fair bit to help address some research questions, and that's ultimately what's been happening with this project.
we've really been looking at how the renewable energy co-op sector is emerging in different parts of the world. What are the key barriers to their implementation here in Canada? There's particular emphasis on Ontario because of the policy framework that we have in the province of Ontario that is enabling, or is meant to enable community renewable energy cooperatives. And then we're using essentially the learning to help further the sector to share resources to influence policy. So those are ultimately the objectives of the project. We're part of we're working on this for 3 years. So the partnership is with York University, and we finished our 2nd year, so I'm starting our 3rd year now. Can everybody hear me? Very quickly about TREC. So it used to stand for Toronto Renewable Energy Cooperative. We've sort of changed the T to TREC, which is a little circular, I understand that. But it's basically because some of our new projects are not based in Toronto, and also because of the work we do back province-wide. And so we're still, small organization, not a lot of resources. Rebranding is not, unfortunately, something that we can afford to do right now, so we're trying to make do with the name. So TREC was established in 1998 for the purpose of developing community-owned renewable energy projects. The directors at the time were very interested in the co-op model as a form of ownership, looking at and sort of being inspired by what was happening in Denmark and Germany around this. They built their first, the first cooperatively owned wind project in Canada, and it was completed in 2002. It's a joint venture with Toronto Hydro. It's a 600 kilowatt wind turbine in downtown Toronto. So very visible, highly visible project. Successful on many levels, financially not so much. Last year we launched SolarShare, which is the first renewable energy co-op in Ontario under the new rules that were introduced called the Green Energy Act and the Feed-in Tariff Program. This is a policy framework that enables individuals or groups that are generating power to feed into the grid and get paid a price per kilowatt hour of their generation. So it's a very particular framework. It's proven now around the world that it's really the most effective way of enabling a diverse set of technologies to participate in the electricity sector. And it's particularly effective for community organizations because it means you're not competing on price with large developers. I'm not going to get into the policy a lot, but I can certainly talk to anybody who's interested in knowing more about that, what the implications are around policy for renewable energy co-op development. TREC is a leader in sustainable energy education. We launched a charitable foundation 2 years ago. We educate about 20,000 children around Ontario in renewable energy technology, and we do that tying into the curriculum. And we're also working on capacity building tools, sharing our learning with other groups that may be, still sort of figuring things out. And then because we have projects in the ground, we can use that to inform policy. So that's TREC in a nutshell. There's a lot going on. There's about 10 people that work at TREC full time, and we have a very committed and engaged board of directors, many of whom have been, or several who've been around since the inception of TREC. So very long lifespan, if you will. So very quickly, when we talk about renewable energy co-ops, there are different forms. In my case, in this presentation, I'm talking specifically about renewable energy projects that generate electricity and feed electricity into the grid. There are also other forms of renewable energy co-ops that are producing biogas, biofuels for heating purposes or for motor fuels. Everything that I'm talking about is specific to electricity generation and distribution. And what's interesting about renewable energy co-ops and part of the challenge that we have in Ontario around renewable energy co-ops is that they're really an investment vehicle. When you become a member of a renewable energy co-op, there's no way of linking your electricity usage to your investment or your membership in the co-op. And this has led to, an ideological challenge for the renewable energy, or for the co-op regulator in Ontario, where where we have a rule which is 50% of your activity should be with members, and there's no way of linking membership with investment in a renewable energy co-op. Or there are, but it's very, very expensive and we haven't gone that route. So that's just to set the stage for, yes, sort of what's happening. And, you know, there's all kinds of challenges around them. If somebody's an investor and you don't have regular interaction with them, what does that mean as a member? Yes?
To clarify the thing about 50% of members, you're talking about members of the worker co-op itself?
No. So the renewable energy co-ops that I'm talking about are not worker co-ops, they are member-based co-ops. So they're producer co-ops that, yes, except that what you're producing cannot be traced back to the user. And so in some ways they become an investment co-op, which is sort of this new breed of co-op, which the regulatory body is uncomfortable with because they're saying you're selling securities, you're not selling a product, so you know, why are you a co-op?
Okay.
I think everybody here is probably familiar with the value of co-ops and why we pursue this model. In the case of in the case of Trek and others in Ontario that are pursuing this model, one of the strong motivations for using the co-op model is that we want to get as many people involved in the co-op, and we see it as a form of education. There is still a lot of resistance around renewable energy. People don't understand that it's, you know, that it is a legitimate form of electricity generation and that it's the future. And so we see the co-op we deliberately keep the entry level low for members, so that for $1,000 or $500 you can participate and earn a return, and then you start to engage with this idea of renewable energy generation. And so that's probably, I think that's certainly unique amongst some of the co-ops that we're seeing evolving in Ontario, is that entry level, even though there's higher transaction costs with each member, we think it's an important part of the service that we provide. So a very quick overview of sort of the international context, or specifically Germany and Denmark, where renewable energy co-ops are sort of the predominant model for ownership. So in Germany, first of all, they've had an incredible history of adding new renewable generation to the grid over the last 20 years. 53,000 megawatts of new generation since 2002, I believe, or since 2000, and 50% of that is owned by individuals, either through the co-op model, or they also use the limited liability partnership model in Germany, and it facilitates itself also to this sort of shared ownership. So $5 billion worth of community money invested, 200,000 Germans who are participating, and you can see that there's been quite a significant increase in the amount of renewable energy generation that's been added to the German grid, and their projections are for 35% in the next 8 years, I guess, and they are on track to meeting that. So in some ways, you know, these numbers illustrate the potential that community power has, but it's, you know, you really need the right framework. Just some numbers demonstrating that, you know, compared to any other owner, private individuals and landowners are by far the greatest. In this graph would be, or this pie chart would be reversed in a place like Ontario. You would have mostly the large energy providers, industry and developers would be the predominant owners of renewable energy generation. Other countries that are sort of strong in terms of individual or local ownership: the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark. Great Britain is, you know, starting to come up. There's a number of co-ops there that are developing, but still, compared to the corporate model, are still a strong minority. And Canada would certainly fall on the level of Spain here in terms of percentages. The history of renewable energy co-ops in Canada. So as I mentioned, the first project was connected to the grid in 2003. It's the Windshare turbine at Exhibition Place in downtown Toronto. There was a really strong support for that project. The folks at Trek, before I joined, managed to raise $750,000 in a couple of months, and they ended up with another $250,000 in escrow waiting to be invested in a new project. And very few people have actually withdrawn their money. They basically said, hang on to it, we like what you're doing, we'll invest in the next project. And so some of those people are now invested in SolarShare. As far as other, so in Ontario then, there was attempts made to start other cooperatives between 2003 and 2009. But the policy framework, the price that was being paid for electricity was not sufficient for groups to get their projects off the ground. And it wasn't until the Green Energy Act was introduced in 2009 that the right framework was created, and principally was this introduction of the feed-in tariff program. There is a community feed-in tariff program in Nova Scotia that's essentially stimulating community ownership there. It's they've essentially set aside about 100 or identified 200 megawatts worth of capacity that community groups can access. To date, while there's been huge interest and uptake in terms of applications, so far there aren't any cooperatives among those groups. So it's interesting to examine why that is the case, and I'm not going to do that here, but we have colleagues in Nova Scotia who are sort of asking that question. It's certainly something we'll be pursuing. In Quebec, there was a special call for proposals from community groups, and they did have a number of co-ops that are under development, but really only one that's been formed called Valeo, and it's really a collaborative of a number of different co-ops, and they are working together as a limited liability partnership. So not exactly the same framework, but the interest is there. As far as the rest of Canada is concerned, well, Paul here was involved in the co-op in Alberta. And there are a number of groups, but very few in each province. And the challenge is really the lack of the ability to feed into the grid and have a mechanism where the co-op can be compensated for the power that is generated. I'm happy to talk to anybody afterwards. Just, in summary, the barriers to community power, this is specific to Ontario, but relevant, I think, to a lot of other provinces as well. So the grid constraint and access to the grid is one of the big issues. The electricity system is controlled by monopoly institutions in many cases, and certainly centralized electricity institutions. And so navigating that as a small community player is incredibly difficult. It's difficult even if you're a small commercial player that has been around for a while. But if you're a local group that's just starting out and you want to put even a small solar system on your rooftop, there's all kinds of channels that you have to go through. And that leads to costly and cumbersome development processes. So there's a lot of time delays, there's a lot of legal documentation you need. These are contractual arrangements, and these are 20-year relationships that we have both with the landowner or the rooftop owner or the site owner, as well as a 20-year relationship with our members in terms of investment, managing their money. There's a steep learning curve for a lot of these groups. There's maybe one or two board members that have experience in the energy sector, and sometimes not necessarily in developing a solar or a wind project. And so, there's a lot of good intention, but sometimes, not actual on-the-ground experience. And so one of the challenges we have is figuring out how can we make that development process easier? How can we achieve economy of scale as projects are coming up? What kind of systems can we create, for instance, to manage members so that we're all using like a centralized platform, so we can ensure that there's a strong, robust system that's being used to manage people's money, but also to ensure there's a long-term relationship with. Sorry, your stop threw me out. Stop. To help the co-op minimize its administrative costs. That's ultimately the goal. And then the other big challenge is around financing. So even going to the co-op, the credit unions right now is a non-starter. They do not really understand this model. They don't see a history with a lot of these co-ops are new, so there's no balance sheet to look at, or income statements for the last 5 years or 3 years, which is sort of the minimum that often they're looking for. So there's a lot of learning, a lot of inventing and innovation that's happening within the sector. which makes it exciting but also very tiring. And that's, I'll leave it there. There's another session tomorrow specifically about renewable energy co-ops. It's tomorrow afternoon at 2:45, I think. So I'll be talking specifically about solar share and that and the lessons learned. So I'll be covering some of the barriers there in more detail and talk about how we can overcome them. And that's it. Thank you very much.
We are going to have our next presentation is exploring the cooperative difference looking at the housing sector. So we've got two presenters, Catherine Lupton-Marie, who is a professor at the Shannon School of Business at Cape Breton University and teaches in the MBA in Community Economic Development Program, and also Alicia Lake, who is a graduate student in that CED MBA program at the University of Cape Breton. So I also want to highlight that we have a special addition to this panel. We have Paul Sabai from the Alberta Community and Cooperative Association, who will be our fourth presenter. We'll still stick to our hour and a half. We'll just save all the questions till the end so that we make sure we have time for all four. And he'll be delivering some statistics to us on survival rates of co-ops in Alberta and British Columbia. So a warm welcome to our presentation.
So just start with a bit of background here. So in Nova Scotia, the provincial government encourages the private sector to develop affordable housing. And it does so by making contributions to the capital costs of housing projects and also by providing subsidized rents to the tenants living in those housing facilities. So to be eligible, a project applicant has to be a private sector organization. So the applicant can be private for profit, can be strictly nonprofit or a nonprofit co-op. They have to be able to demonstrate local demand for affordable housing, and they have to agree to keep housing affordable for a minimum of 10 years. Otherwise, there's no kind of constraining environment. For example, yesterday, JJ McMurray was talking a little bit about the work that you're doing in renewable energy and saying that the regulatory environment is such that it's hard to see difference because it's hard for energy co-ops to behave as true co-ops or exhibit difference, right? I see that in other research that I do, for example, in the childcare sector. There's such a strict environment that oversees childcare organizations that it's hard to see different. Housing in Nova Scotia is not like that. The government is quite hands-off. Applicants just have to meet these three criteria right here. So as a result of this government program, in 2008, three remarkably similar affordable housing projects emerged in the province. These projects are of similar size, so they provide between 16 and 22 units of housing for seniors. And they're also located in remarkably similar communities, small communities in the province. But they are important, or they are distinct in one important way, and organizational form is different. So here are two pictures of two of the housing facilities that we studied. The one in the bottom there is a nonprofit housing facility for seniors, and the one in the upper corner is the cooperative housing facility. As you can see, it's colder in Cape Breton than it is in Montreal, taken in winter time. So in any case, what we're doing in this research is we're exploring potential differences between cooperative and nonprofit housing for seniors. Those are the case studies that we have completed. We have yet to complete the for-profit housing research. So in this presentation, we are comparing co-ops to nonprofits. We're doing the comparison at three different levels. We're looking at the developmental level. So this includes how the initiatives emerge, the role of key actors, and the role of social economy networks. We're also looking at design considerations in these facilities. We're comparing difference at the organizational level. So there we're specifically looking at governance. And we're also comparing these these facilities as far as the experiences of people who actually live there. So we used a flexible case study design, and we collected
Both of things that they liked about their housing. Primarily having people close by and having everything on one level was really important as well. And both groups also, of course, spoke about negative things that they didn't like about their housing, such as kind of the lack of privacy. The walls are all very thin in these buildings, and other tenants smoking and other issues such as that. And both groups talked about their lives before coming to the housing. So also, about their decision to move and that type of thing. So they spoke a lot about, that difficulty in deciding to move their home and to come, how many possessions they had to give up to kind of move into a smaller place, and uncertainty, like not knowing what to expect coming to this housing. So I think it's important to understand that this is really a transitional phase in their lives. They're kind of moving from one stage, into another. So most are moving out of their own homes, so they don't have a lot of experience with a landlord, per se. We have like high home ownership in Nova Scotia, so I think this was really reflected in the people we talked with. And most were living alone and isolated, so a lot of people had lost their spouse and that type of thing, so they were kind of coming from more solitary. And some actually reported being scared in their own homes, like even being afraid to sleep and that type of thing because they are so alone, right? And then a lot of them are going through changes in their independence. So some people are, losing the ability to drive or to take care of their home, that type of thing. And also, because I think Catherine mentioned the lack of design features in the house for this aging in place, they realized too this isn't their permanent home. Like this is going to be kind of a pit stop before moving into nursing home care. So a lot of people talked about living alone caused them stress, but also caused stress on their families. So some people were actually pressured to move into seniors buildings by their families who were kind of worried and didn't want them to be alone or were worried that they would get hurt. And also not being able to manage stairs was another big factor that actually made people leave their homes. And most people reported that just the household upkeep, like mowing the lawn, snow removal, that type of thing was another big motivating factor for them to come to these homes. So we talk a lot about the social aspects of these homes, primarily because they're coming from being alone, so this was probably their favorite thing, I think, for most people. So most people reported that they knew everyone in the building, or at least most people, and some report like building very close friendships with the other people in the building. Some spoke about the support that they give each other, so helping each other with tasks or giving each other transportation. Also, 5 minutes, oh my goodness. Okay. And then, and just kind of having those group activities. So really, it was only the tenants that felt like they had a true voice in the building and with the management. So one person said, I think that because it's a co-op, we have more voice in things. So just because of that. And though this is a recent thing, like tenants weren't always on the board, we think that this does kind of help inform our understanding of the cooperative difference, because the tenants are seeing a difference now that they know that they have that participation and that involvement. They really see that, and this bottom quote that you could read, this person says that in the other seniors' homes, people don't know what's going on, but they know because they have these tenants on the board. So that was a big difference. So in decision making, both felt that they liked what management was doing, that management did the best that they could do with the funds. And both groups felt that the ultimate decision-making power was going to be in the board of directors. But this is probably where we saw the biggest differences, I would say. So with the co-op building, tenants go right directly to the tenants that are on the board of directors with any suggestions or complaints or issues. And they feel very connected with those people, so they have a very clear line of communication. And then with the nonprofit people, they either go to the property manager or put a suggestion in a suggestion box, which isn't as personal, and you know, they don't feel that connection. So the co-op tenants really felt that they now have more of a say over things that happen to them as well, like that they can band together if they want to see changes, they can all kind of come together and present that, or if there's, you know, any types of complaints or issues, that they have more of a say in what's going on. And they also feel that now that they know there's tenants on the board, now they know what is going on with the finances, so they can actually kind of make some decisions or more suggestions. They know exactly what's going on. And there is a kind of a funny dynamic between tenants, I think, and their landlord. I think probably in every apartment building. But one person kind of said, if you have somebody fighting for you, then at least you might have a chance of winning. So we've been talking about tenants on the board. So that was my experience with tenants.
So just some conclusions here, we have 2 minutes, so we'll get this done. So what are we concluding with our preliminary analysis of this data? So indeed, both housing organizations share, in fact, remarkably similar characteristics, which are typical of social economy organizations, with the unique difference of the cooperative being tenant involvement. We think that the data also supports this concept of the social.
The only effects that we felt is we couldn't fish in that area in the close vicinity of the turbine. But I mean, that's where it comes in. If it's more turbines, more displacement. But the environmental effects on that one turbine, we didn't see nothing. But
so it didn't really. Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, it didn't really affect you significally. That's what you're saying, or
just in the
displacement?
Displacement of every year.
Okay.
Because I mean, in reality, that base of that channel is about 2 miles wide, but it's only about 3/4 of a mile. That's really productive, like for fish, where we can trap fish, and where the fish go. Actually, everybody's kind of fighting over the same little piece of 3/4 mile real estate, tidal power, the fish migration, and the fishermen that want to catch the fish. So that's the thing. But that one turbine, it displaced us some, but environmental effects, we didn't see none, but seeing it wasn't there.
Okay, so what do you expect environmental effects to be if and when tidal power develops on a larger scale?
I don't know. I can't. I don't know.